A warm welcome to each and every one of you. We are gathered here today not only to share knowledge, but also to explore solutions to one of the most pressing challenges in our digital age. That is how to keep people's data private while we can still benefit from the new technologies. As you can see, technologies like data science, machine learning, and AI need a lot of data to work well. But this data often contains personal and sensitive information about individuals. So one of the biggest challenges is how to make sure we can keep this data private while we can still being able to use it for research and building our AI or different data machine learning science models. Even if you have been doing research for a very long time, this can be a difficult process because making data anonymous or the identification of them can be challenging. And because of the nature of the data or the various technical obstacles. That's why McGill Digital Research Services Hub, the DRS, has put together a set of 4 workshops to help researchers like you to better understand how to make data anonymous. This workshop will teach you how to both the ideas behind the data anonymizations and also how to do it in practice for different types of data. So today we are starting the first workshop in this series, and we are very happy to have Kristi Thompson with us. Kristi worked at Western libraries and has lots of experience with different types of research methods, data management, and making data anonymous with statistical programming. She has worked on many research projects and is now editing a Canadian textbook on managing research data. Without further delay, let me pass the virtual floor to Kristi. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin, for that great introduction, and welcome everyone to this workshop series on data. Again, I'm Kristi Thompson, joining you today from Western University in London, Ontario. Western University is occupying the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinungton nations. I'd like to thank you all for coming to hear me talk about safe sharing for sensitive data. More specifically, I'm going to be delving into questions like how do you tell if a data file can be shared and how can you create safer versions of your data? Essentially, is the safe shareable dataset a dream or a myth? I'm going to be considering that question. So just some context. In Canada, the tri-agency, the 3 federal funding agencies, came up with a policy under which grant recipients are going to be required to deposit their data in an archive. In the US, the National Institute of Health, along with many of their other funding agencies, also requires the sharing of data wherever possible. National Science Foundation expects investigators to share data with other researchers. And in addition, many journals are telling people who submit papers, show us your data. Now, this does not mean that all data has to be shared openly, but most current academic and journal repositories are designed to make open sharing the most convenient option. So grant telling you you have to share your data, or at least you have to deposit it, only places to deposit it, make open sharing the default. What do you do? I'm approaching this as a research data management librarian, someone who's expected to help researchers comply with these policies. Are researchers expected to understand when data de-identification is needed to comply with data sharing mandates? Are they expected to anonymize their own data and make it open? Are the data creators expected to do this? Are research ethics boards or institutional review boards expected to have the knowledge to know what's going on and whether or not this data should be shared? As a researcher, as a data curator, as someone who sits on research ethics boards, these questions are all of great interest to me. And I think in general, the answer is not really. I'm going to start by discussing some of the background to data de-identification and some of the key concepts: identifiers, quasi-identifiers, risk. Okay. Direct identifiers are any information that is collected by the researcher that places study participants at immediate risk of being re-identified. So things like names, phone numbers, social insurance numbers, student numbers, and so on. You can probably think of others. The definition of direct identifiers is actually a bit more expansive than you might expect, particularly when it comes to geography. Any geography containing less than 20,000 people is often considered a direct identifier. I'll be getting into why a little later. Exact dates linked to individuals, such as birth dates or dates of medical procedures, dates of graduation, and so on, are also widely considered personally identifying. In US, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act has a list of 18 personal identifiers that's frequently referred to in the literature, while the British Medical Journal includes a list of 28 identifiers based on multiple international guidelines. There's also a Canadian list in the text I recently co-edited, Research Data Management in the Canadian Context. Okay, that's direct identifiers. Pretty much anyone who is working with data should know that you need to go through the data and remove direct identifiers. Where things get sticky are quasi-identifiers. Quasi-identifiers are characteristics relating to individuals that could, in theory, be linked with other data sources to violate people's confidentiality. A variable can be considered a quasi-identifier if an attacker could plausibly match that variable to information from another source. So, information in the dataset that can be matched to information outside of the dataset and used to determine the identity of an individual. Some variables may be used in combination to derive quasi-identifiers. For example, community size, at first glance not particularly identifying, could be combined with a broader geographic grouping to infer location more precisely and narrow down exactly where somebody is coming from. Quasi-identifiers are commonly thought of as demographic and socioeconomic variables that have the potential to be linked with other data sources to violate the confidentiality of participants, or to be recognized by a person acquainted with the survey respondent. So specific examples include age, gender identity, income, occupation, industry, place of work, geography, ethnic and immigration variables, and so on. However, other quasi-identifiers could include things like membership in specific organizations or use of specific services. So coming up with an exhaustive list of all possible quasi-identifiers is probably not possible and would not be necessarily even useful. Variables that relate to geography in any way always need to be treated with extreme caution. Potential hidden geographic identifiers can include features like presence of a university hospital, international airport in a respondent's community. So, for example, a variable giving the distance to the nearest emergency department in a health survey. These variables all need to be considered alongside any contextual information about the dataset. For example, is it clear from external information that the participants in this study lived in a particular area or type of area, or belonged to a particular business or had a particular occupation? Contextual information about the data set should also be considered a variable that could be matched to external information. A couple of technical definitions. Risk is created when variables can isolate individuals in the data set. So a variable can distinguish an individual in the data set from other individuals in the same data set. Identifying information that isolates individuals can be matched to persistent information that an attacker may reasonably have access to. And combining the two will give an attacker more information than they would otherwise have. A set of records that has the same values on all quasi-identifiers is called an equivalence class. An equivalence class of 1 corresponds to an individual who is unique in the data set on some combination of characteristics. Such a person may be at risk of being identified. This person is called a sample unique. If your survey is a complete sample of some population, this person is also a population unique. If the survey is not a complete sample, the person may or may not be a population unique. You probably don't know. So now you know what quasi-identifiers are, and that they can be used to potentially narrow down the identity of respondents to a survey. So, what do you do about them? In theory, you could, of course, just delete or mask them all the same way you would with direct identifiers, but doing so will seriously impact the ability of future researchers to make use of a data set. I mean, there's not much point in sharing a data set that has hardly any variables in it. What is needed is some way of assessing the quasi-identifiers to determine how much risk they actually contain. This process is called statistical disclosure risk assessment. A technique called K-anonymity is the best known way of doing this formally. Other techniques include using heuristics and rules of thumb, checking lists of identifiers and quasi-identifiers, and following some standard set of practices. These can help as a first step and may be reasonable for datasets with a very limited number of variables. But as data collections increase in complexity, the utility of heuristics diminishes to the point that I'd personally consider them window dressing. You're basically just hoping that no attackers are going to make a serious attempt to attack your data set because you don't know what holes are there to find. Assessing quasi-identifiers. First pass. This is where you can think about the heuristics. So as a first pass, there are some common sense rules of thumb you can use to assess the quasi-identifiers in a data set. Quasi-identifying variables containing groups with small numbers of respondents. So for example, a religion variable with only 3 individual responses of Buddhism in a data set where most of your respondents have other religious identities, pose high risk. Extreme population values, for example, someone having more than 10 children, a very high income, and so on, also pose high risk. So you need to consider both the size of identifiable groups in the potential general population that your survey is drawn from and within the data set. So if what you've got is just a random random digits cell phone user survey that covers Canada, and you happen to only have one person from Winnipeg in the data set, but the survey doesn't really narrow it down more than that, that person's pretty safe. And again, contextual information that accompanies the data should also be part of the analysis. If it's clear from the context of your research that all your interview subjects worked at a particular tool and die plant in Oshawa, that narrows things down quite a bit. Or if you've only got one person from Winnipeg in your survey, but it's not actually a random population survey, but a survey of NHL referees, that also narrows things down quite a bit. You can never consider a data set in isolation from the contextual information that comes with it. Common sense can only take you so far, but it helps. Look at the demographic variables in the data set and consider describing an individual to a friend using only the values of those variables. I'm thinking of a person living in Toronto who is female, married, has a university degree, is between the ages of 40 and 55, and has an income between $60,000 and $75,000. In general, that person is going to be pretty safe, even if there is only one such person in the data set. Unless you know this is a survey of soccer referees, then it might be riskier. However, you also need to consider unusual combinations of variables. Now, you may only have that set of variables I mentioned in the previous question, but let's say someone belongs to the under 17 age group and responded that they're married. The person's probably pretty unusual. So how do you figure this out without needing to know every single combination in the data? Basically, you have to mathematically assess every combination in the data. K-anonymity is a mathematical approach to demonstrating that a data set's been anonymized. It was first proposed by computer scientists in 1998 and has formed the basis of formal data anonymization efforts ever since then. Concept. It should not be possible to isolate fewer than K individual cases in your dataset based on any combination of potentially identifying variables. That is, a record cannot be distinguished from K-1 other records in its equivalence class. K is a number set by the researcher. I've seen 3 and 5 commonly used. In practice, I've never seen a value higher than 5. 5 is a reasonable number to use in general. An example may help illustrate this concept. Imagine your survey, let's say, of workers at that tool and die factory in Oshawa, has 3 demographic variables: age group, gender, and ethnic group. If an individual in the data set is not a member of an visible minority, is male, and is between 25 and 30, then for the data to have K-anonymity with K equal to 5, there must be at least 4 other individuals in the data set with the same set of characteristics. And this must also be true for every other individual in the data set. Each person must have at least 4 data twins. So in this example, cases 1, 6, and 13 from an equivalence class with a K of 3. So each case in this equivalence class has 2 data twins. Even if an attacker knew that an individual was in the data set and was able to match their characteristics against the data, they would not be able to tell which of the 3 cases was the target individual. By contrast, individual 14, case 14 in this data set has no data twins. It's a sample unique. A dataset's K is the size of the smallest equivalence class in the dataset, in this case, 1. In order to achieve K-anonymity with a K of at least 5 in a dataset, you use what are called data reduction techniques, including global data reduction and local suppression. Global data reduction includes grouping variable responses into categories, for example, age in 10-year increments, or for already categorical variables, merging them into larger groups. And in extreme cases, data reduction includes the complete removal of risky variables from the dataset. Local suppression means deleting individual cases or responses. So, for example, that member of the under 17 age group who responded married might have their response to the marriage question deleted as an alternative to further recoding the marriage question. For example, a member of the under 17 age group who responded married might have their response to the marriage question deleted as an alternative to further recoding the otherwise non-risky variables of age group or marital status. By looking at frequencies and creating bivariate tables of variables, you can single out the riskiest categories on variables and regroup or suppress them as a prelude to checking K-anonymity. It's relatively easy to check K-anonymity using standard statistical software, even though most packages don't have built-in functions for doing so. I'll be talking a little bit more about doing this later, but here I've just provided an example of how you would do it in a couple of common statistical programming languages. Now, K-anonymity is intended to be a form of guaranteed data anonymization, and it's often described as such. It guarantees that every record in the anonymized data will be indistinguishable from K-1 other records in the same dataset. However, research participants are not generally told that no one will know which line of the data file holds their confidential information. They're told their answers to research questions will be kept confidential. I see some questions are coming in. I'll be pausing for a break after another section or so, and then answering a few questions. So, attribute disclosure. Within a few years of K-anonymity being first published as a solution to the privacy dilemma, researchers had pointed out some potential issues. I'm going to be looking at the homogeneity attack, which is the problem of attribute disclosure in the absence of identity disclosure. Let's go back to that data set of tool and die workers at a plant in Oshawa. Cases 1, 6, and 13 in this dataset still form an equivalence class with k equal to 13. So even if you know which people in this survey population match those characteristics, you can't tell which person matches which case. But here I'm showing the dataset and also showing how they responded to a question on whether or not they thought that they should unionize. People at their plant should unionize. And it so happens that all the people in this equivalence class answered that question the same way. They all said yes. So you now know how all three of them answered this question. Confidentiality has been violated. I don't know who person 1 is, but I know how they answered the question, and I can look at the general population this survey was drawn from and say, yep, you, and you want to form a union. Extensions of K-anonymity, including P-anonymity and L-diversity, were developed in an effort to deal with the attribute disclosure issue. However, as one set of authors noted in a review of K-anonymity and its variants, neither K-anonymity nor its enhancements are entirely successful in ensuring that no privacy leakage occurs while keeping a reasonable data utility level. A brief explanation of one of the variants of L-diversity will serve to illustrate the problem. A dataset is said to have distinct L-diversity if, for each group of records sharing a combination of demographic attributes, or an equivalence class, there are at least L different values for each confidential variable. So in our example workplace dataset, every group of data twins would need to include both yes and no responses to the union question, since 2 would be the maximum possible value for L in this question. And this would have to be true for some value of L for every confidential answer in the dataset. Now imagine a typical survey dataset with dozens of questions, each of which needs to be considered for L diversity for every single equivalence class. Basically, the issues with techniques like L diversity are they're only practical to implement in datasets with very few data variables. There really aren't any computationally efficient ways of doing this. The larger your dataset gets, the more variables you have, the time it takes to do this computationally increases exponentially, and it's far too time consuming to do by hand. For some of them are esoteric methods of implementing confidentiality. They haven't even described theoretical implementations, and it's just very, very time consuming. It's been demonstrated that even in relatively simple cases, such as L diversity with very few attributes, automatically solving for optimal data utility while protecting privacy is NP hard, meaning essentially that the time taken to run such an algorithm increases exponentially with the size of the data set. And even if they could be implemented, in most cases, achieving anything like distinct L diversity or T closeness or P diversity or any of the other known methods would completely destroy the reanalysis value of the dataset, making going to this level of effort to make data shareable rather pointless. I'm just going to have a quick look at the 2 questions that have been answered before I move on to the next session. Regarding K-anonymity, wouldn't you need to adjust the K value depending on the size of the population or data set? Actually, that's not generally done. People just stick with a K of 5. That's because essentially what we're worried about is the absolute value, not percentages. We're not looking at percentages. The larger the population is your sample is drawn from, and the smaller a percentage the sample is, the safer your respondents are. But the value of K is chosen as a bare minimum. So even if with a complete sample, you at most cannot tell a person from 5 other people. If anyone has looked at mathematically coming up with an optimal K as opposed to a conventional K, I don't actually know about it. So thank you. The local TISHA asked, the local suppression would be done after completing our analysis, but before sharing the data set. And yes, in general, you would do the local suppression before sharing the data set. However, you would also want to review anything you published from the data set based on your analysis to make sure that there was no possibility of residual disclosure. Residual disclosure is what happens when you publish tables from a data set, but someone can determine from multiple tables that there's a particular individual that has a particular characteristic. And also, if you have an individual that is unique in a data set, they may not actually be of a great deal of value for analysis purposes. So it might be harmless to do this particular level of suppression before analyzing your data set, but I'm primarily concerned with what you do before you publish the data set. Okay. Anonymous participant asked, regarding K-anonymity, what happens with your dealing with dates? Exact dates are basically considered highly identifying. I would remove them, or at least generalize them to the level of a year, or maybe a year in groups before you even start on your analysis. And then you would deal with the year or the grouped year as you would deal with any other categorical variable. Okay, moving on. I'm going to talk about the role of sampling. Until now, we've been talking as if, when thinking of K-anonymity, as if our data set was a complete sample of some population and as if it was possible to know that everyone who was in the data set. However, in most cases, we're going to be dealing with sample surveys. Let's return to that workplace survey, but this time imagine that this data set is only a 50% sample of the population, that population again being people who work at this particular tool and die plant. In this example, cases 1, 6, and 13 still form an equivalence class, but the equivalence class has 5 additional members who are not in the data set, and their views on forming a union are unknown. So I'm showing you here a 50% sample. I've got those 15 people who we originally talked about who are in the data set, and then we've got an additional 15 people who are in the population but not in the data set. So assuming that an observer has no way of knowing whether a particular individual is in the published data, being in this equivalence class no longer definitively reveals anyone's opinions, because you don't know who's who. Basically, sampling creates uncertainty that any given individual is in the data set at all. A sample unique may not be a population unique, although this is still a concern. So that is, if an equivalence class in the dataset can be assumed to have co-equivalents or data twins outside the dataset whose opinions or attributes are unknown, then attributes are not disclosed by membership in an equivalence class. And this is generally considered a reasonable assumption in cases where K-anonymity is met for K of greater than or equal to 5, and the sample is a small subset of the population it is drawn from. So attribute disclosure in the absence of identity disclosure ceases to be a significant concern in the case of a sample that is a small percentage of a large population. And if you're asking me exactly what a small sample of a large population is, I'll refer you to the literature because I'm not sure that there's a really generally agreed upon answer to that question at this point. Okay, now I'm going to start talking about some bad examples. This is the part where I start telling you data horror stories, including the story of how and why I personally became involved with data anonymization efforts in the first place. Facepalm. I first became seriously involved with data anonymization efforts due to a data rescue project. A series of government department data sets were released on an open government data portal due to an open government mandate. The Versions that were initially made available were unusable due to missing documentation and general incomprehensibility. Basically, researchers could not make use of this data, so we didn't know why it had even been released in the condition it was released. Some data librarians, including myself, someone from Queen's named Alexandra Cooper, and a few others, looked into this problem because we wanted to make this data available to researchers at our institutions. We reached out to the government departments, got some additional versions of the data and some documentation, and discovered that this data had been released without being anonymized. Our contact recognized that this was a problem, but they had no de-identified version of the data. They didn't know how to de-identify data. They had no resources for fixing the problem. The data was already out there. We decided that we would leave the messy versions undocumented and would provide anonymized versions that had been reunited with their documentation. Basically, it was the best we could do under the circumstances. So the first test survey I'm talking about was a survey of adolescents who were asked about an ad campaign having to do with drug use. There were about 1,500 respondents in this sample, very limited demographics and various non-identifying variables. They were being asked questions about how they responded to some surveys that had some commercials that had been run having to do with illicit drugs, and the non-identifying questions also happened to have some things about drug use in them. So this was a highly sensitive survey that had been released. The 5 quasi-identifier variables of concern included age, which was in 3 categories. These were adolescents. I think they were 12 to 13, 14 to 16, and 17 to 19, or something like that. Gender or sex, which had 2 categories in this survey. Geographic region, which had 7. Visible minority status, which had 2. And Indigenous status, which had 2 categories. Simple multiplication leads us to 168 possible categories in this data set. In fact, there were 126 equivalence classes because visible minority and Indigenous status are considered mutually exclusive as defined. Ask Health Canada. Now, if these 126 equivalence classes had been distributed equally across the data set, we would expect each equivalence class to contain about 12 cases. However, for most real-world variables, some combinations are much larger than others. There are more non-visible minorities than visible minorities. Some geographic regions have more people in them than others. In practice, we had 21 equivalence classes with only a single member and a total of 42 equivalence classes with less than 5 members. So 1,500 respondents, that's a reasonable size survey. That's actually kind of a typical opinion poll. 5 quasi-identifier variables is really not a huge number. We were not able to produce a data set that satisfied K-anonymity, let alone any more stringent criteria such as L diversity, while retaining these 5 variables in their original form. However, how risky exactly would it have been to retain this region variable and publish this data set? Were the sample unique cases in this data set, the 21 equivalence classes with only a single member, also population uniques? Well, I decided to look into this. I checked it by downloading a Census of Canada public use file to produce a data set that matched my survey, but represented the population of Canada aged, it was actually 13 to 15, sorry, in Canada at that time as a whole. So I took the Census of Canada and manipulated it. I cut it down to just that age group. I cut the variables down so they matched that number. I weighted the samples. So basically I had an artificial census of the entire population the survey had been drawn from. And then I ran K-anonymity on this new artificial census and found that each sample unique in the survey was estimated to have a minimum of 369 data twins in the general population. So K-anonymity was overestimating re-identification risk by a factor of 370. So, okay, what did we do? We ended up suppressing the region variable, but releasing the survey with the data grouped as I had specified on the previous slide. And yeah, that survey has now been made available to researchers, and they can use it if they like and get insight into drug use habits of various Canadian adolescents. I forgot to mention, but the original version of the survey also had things in it like partial postal codes and so on. So it was really a lot worse than I'm indicating here. Okay, second test survey. This is another survey that was made available under the same, possibly not completely thought through, open government mandate, possibly not entirely unlike a certain trade agency mandate that is now being thought through. There was an additional test survey that was released with an additional survey that was released on a government portal with a few demographic variables, but some additional data was associated with participant location. This was a service survey of a population living in small and remote communities. It did not have exact location, community names, or anything obvious like that, except province once we'd got through with it. But it did have some respondents who were indicated as being located on an Indigenous reservation or community, and it also had a variable giving approximate distance to the nearest major city. And because of the type of survey, it was a survey of service use and access. We were being cautious about what exact variables we were going to delete. The original data set, before we cleaned it, also had partial postal codes that could be used to check guesses. So what did I do? Penetration testing. Penetration testing is another technique for assessing whether a survey can be released. Rather than doing K-anonymity testing and looking only within the data set, you go out yourself and try to link the data set with external data and see if you can re-identify people. It's a means of assessing the resistance of a de-identified data set to re-identification of survey participants or their attributes. And this is one place, by the way, where artificial intelligence might be of use in testing for whether a data set should be released. Now, remember, quasi-identifiers contain information that can be matched to persistent information that an attacker may reasonably have access to. So from publicly available information, a data intruder can easily construct a table of reservations by province, and it can also construct a table showing their distance from the nearest city using, for example, geospatial software. So for each participant, we looked at their province of residence and distance from the nearest city and compared it to entries in this table of reservations by province and distance to nearest city. So, hypothetical example. Participant living in Alberta on a reservation who said that they lived 80 kilometers from the nearest city. We found that in this data set, there were only two possibilities, living 10 kilometers apart from one another. They could have been a member of the Samsum tribe, of the Ermineskin tribe. So of over 1,000 individuals surveyed, a single location for their potential place of residence could be found for 98. And this was just doing a very rough penetration test using direct distances. We didn't go to the additional effort to determine driving distance, but that would have been a possibility. Of these 98 individuals, the suppressed value for the partial postal code, which we deleted from the released data set, showed that this guess was correct for 24 cases, or 25% of guesses. We could have increased this accuracy, I strongly suspect, with access to more specialized geospatial tools, but at that point we decided this penetration test had gone far enough. So we're narrowing people down to living in a very small community, and given just a few very basic demographic variables that remained in the data set, like age group and so on, yeah, you probably could have identified these actual human beings. Distance from respondents' community to nearest large city does not generally show up on list of potential direct or quasi-identifiers to check for. And another thing you can learn from this penetration test is that variables may be used in combination to derive other quasi-identifiers. So do you burn it all down? How do you ensure that a data set has been fully de-identified? Well, anything relating to geography needs to be considered. You need to think about the fact when you're reviewing a data set before release that similar variables can indirectly identify other groups, such as, for example, clubs, organizations, employers, occupation in combination with region, occupation in combination with income, all those things. And yeah, now I'm going to be moving on to some ways in which you can automate de-identification of a data set. But first, again, I'm going to pause and look at the Q&A. Okay. Serge Bauderet asked, in a sampling example, how does the researcher know that the view of unreviewed workers are not known to management? I assume you're saying that if the manager of these employees already knew who wanted to join a union, they would be able to identify the person in the data set. That's true. However, what we're assessing this data set for is the concern that releasing this data, for example, sharing it with the manager, will give the manager information that they don't already have. So if the information that would be revealed by releasing this data is already known to the managers, then releasing the data set is not actually causing any additional damage. So this is part of the contextual information you need to think about. If I share this data with a target audience, am I going to be giving them access to information that they don't already have? As to knowing whether or not the information in the data set is identifying, that's a more difficult question and has to be based on the contextual information of the person who's reviewing the data. That is not something I can give you an automated response for. Okay, anonymous participant. If a data set might be of less value when processed to become K-anonymous, would it not be safer to consider the data to be non-anonymous and treat the data set as one that should not be published and only shared under certain conditions to avoid data horrors? Yes, that is often the case. In fact, you may want to consider multiple different layers of sharing. So I've worked on projects where we released an anonymous data set, which was with considerably reduced use. And that data set was released as part of a demonstration program and also to be used for teaching. And the advantage of releasing a data set with much lower data utility is that it allows people to know about the data set and look at what's going on in the data generally, and then maybe request access to a more secure version of the data. So sometimes maybe you'll look at the data and say, if I anonymize this data, there's probably no point in releasing it, and that's that. And then you would tell the government, if you were writing a data management plan, that I'm just not going to share any version of this data set because there'd be no point. Other times you may release a heavily anonymized data set and include in the documentation. This may be useful for testing purposes or figuring out what's going on, or for education purposes. You can reach out to us if you want to know more. Other times you may be able to release an anonymized data set that is in fact still useful for some purposes. It's one of those contextual questions that I cannot provide an answer to you. because it's going to be different with every data set. Okay, Samir Sangani, can you provide information on best practices in using K-anonymity with linkages? I found if someone has access to another data set, it could link with the K-anonymous data set and may be able to identify individuals. So yeah, that is what is going on with K-anonymity. You are looking for variables in your data set that can be linked to external variables. What you're doing with K-anonymity is you're trying to cut down the number of linkages that can be made. If any potential combination of variables that could be linked to external variables can only narrow things down to 5 individuals, then no matter how many linkages you perform, you still can't tell which of those 5 is which. Beyond that, I'm not entirely sure what is being asked. The point of K-anonymity is to basically mask the individuals in your data set so that every person is hidden within a crowd of people who are identical to them. Nina Bauman, as a librarian, at what point do you recommend researchers employ professional de-identifiers? When they have funding to? Really, that's actually not something that I can recommend because I've never had funding to work with a professional identifier. Sorry. But basically, if you have funding and you know of professional de-identifiers, then consider it. If you don't have anyone who has the knowledge to de-identify the data set, then consider it. Otherwise, probably consider not releasing the data. Can you give us an example of AA models to test penetration of the data? No, that's not something I can do within the context of this session, but you can reach out to me separately. Serge followed up his question with management might know people who were in and not in the data set. And in that case, then what you're working with is a known population, not an unknown population. So you have to treat your data set as if it's a complete sample. Basically, if people may have more information about the data, then if people might have additional information about the people in your data, then that's something you need to take into account. And Jessica also asked, the manager union question wouldn't be a concern that all people with a certain set of variables said they would unionize because the manager might hold that against the people with those characteristics. So this type of person is likely to unionize. And again, yes, that's a concern. Inferential disclosure is always a concern. Basically, what I'm providing you with is a set of tools. I am very carefully not saying that if your data meets K-anonymity or if your data matches an external sample, then it's safe. What I am doing is providing you with a set of tools you can use to come up with estimates of how safe your data is that you need to combine with contextual knowledge and risk analysis that cannot be automated, that needs to be done of what needs to be done. I cannot provide you with a complete answer of if your data meets K-anonymity with a K of this and is drawn from a sample of that and is a percentage of the other, then this is 100% safe, because that is not a thing that can be done with our current knowledge. So the next question, several more questions are, what is the minimum K-anonymity value that we can take? I cannot answer that. There is no answer. K equals 5 is commonly used, but there is no 100% safe data. As I started with at the beginning, safe sharing, completely safe sharing, is it a dream or is it a myth? One or the other. Serge Boraday suggested releasing a sample of the data, and yes, that's also often a technique that's done. You can release a subsample. Anonymous participant, to be honest about conclusions you make in your results or published articles, shouldn't you have to report on what anonymization measures you took? And how can you do such reporting in a safe way? Yes, you do need to report on what processing your data went through before you did your analysis. And how can you do such reporting in a safe way? And again, it's going to be contextual. I cannot provide you with an answer to most of these questions, which are going to give you 100% safety, because that's a dream. Final question before I move on. Felicity Taylor asks, should libraries that publish data be responsible for verifying that the data is anonymous? Asking for a friend. If the library is actually taking the role of publisher and saying that they're in the role of publisher, they might want to consider that. I suspect it's a very bad idea, and I think that it's probably something that is not going to be within the abilities of most librarians. What you probably want to do is have people who are depositing data in your place sign some kind of an agreement saying that they attest that their data has been anonymized. Okay, moving on. Thank you. Those were really good questions. Okay, I'm going to be starting to talk a little bit about automation. How do you automate this? How do you actually implement K-anonymity in practice? Okay, anonymization hierarchies. Software tools for de-identifying quantitative data that I have investigated take a hierarchy approach to automatically de-identifying data. This basically means that the user needs to predefine possible generalizations for the quasi-identifiers in the data, and the program searches for possible solutions and recommends a set of generalizations to use. For datasets with many quasi-identifiers, or cases where several datasets with similar quasi-identifiers need to be de-identified, this is something that might be a useful approach. Even if it's not something you're going to be doing formally, it provides you with a useful way of thinking about how to anonymize a data set and how to play off different characteristics against each other. So to help you visualize what I'm talking about, here's a possible hierarchy for the variable marital status. So the original form of the variable might have categories of legally married, common law, single, divorced, separated, and widowed. A first attempt at developing a hierarchy for this variable and grouping it might be living with spouse, single, and formerly married. So living with spouse would group legally married and common law, and formerly married would group divorced, separated, and widowed. Those might be categories of interest depending on what you're looking at. And then if you find out that's still too revealing, the next thing in the hierarchy might be living with spouse versus not living with spouse. And if that's still too risky, then the final option would be to delete the variable. And the user would need to predefine a hierarchy like this for every potential quasi-identifier in the data set to fully make use of the anonymization tool. The tools that use things like that, when I was initially working on a de-identification project, and later while contributing to some documentation on data anonymization, I tested several different anonymization packages that I found recommended on various lists. Many of the packages that are out there are not terribly useful unless you already have fairly advanced programming skills. For example, one of them is a set of Java routines. Another that I'm going to be talking about in a bit involves using the software package R. So they're things that are largely of use to people who already kind of know what they're doing. I don't think there are many packages out there that I would turn an untrained user on. The most functional ones out there include SDC Micro, and ARX is another freely available open source tool that's going to be discussed in the next workshop in this series. Again, commercial software and for-fee services exist, but so far no one's funded me to try them. Okay, what about artificial intelligence and fuzzy logic, things like that? Sometimes when I've discussed this topic previously, I've gotten pushback on the whole concept of data anonymization with comments like, with artificial intelligence, you can never be sure. Well, yes and no. Artificial intelligence isn't actually magic. Artificial intelligence is artificial intelligence. It's coming up with an artificial way of doing things that, in general, humans are also capable of doing, just more slowly and clumsily. If all records in a data set are mathematically equivalent to each other, which is what we're going for with pure K-anonymity, then AI can't separate them any more than a human can. What I can do is search through records quickly and search for external variables to match them to very quickly. AI can do inferential disclosure, of course, data mining to conclude that someone who has these characteristics is more likely to have those other characteristics as well. But people can do that too. It isn't a new risk. In fact, it's kind of the fundamental purpose of a lot of social science research. However, what happens with artificial intelligence and big data is that we may need to expand our concept of what a potential identifier is. We need to think about what is in the data that may be matched to external information. Linking characteristics to identify people can only be done if there are external comparators out there, but there's a lot of data out there and more every day. Think about things like physical or medical characteristics. Could they be inferred from social media discourse? Could someone data mine Twitter looking for characteristics and then try to match them in things in your data? Think about databases that track cookies. Think about external commercial entities. Could they have a profile of locations people have visited, medicines that have been bought, political opinions? Our corporate overlords out there are collecting a lot of data with very little oversight. When it comes to questions like this, my main recommendation at this point is to consider harms. What harm could be done by releasing this data? What kind of information is in this data that's not already out there that could be determined by looking at the data? If you've got that union workplace and it's a 50% sample and there could be inferential disclosure that maybe makes your union, makes the manager more biased against people with certain characteristics because they think they're likely to join a union, don't release it or only release a sample of the data. Think about harm. Consider not releasing the data. So some final observations. Guaranteeing that data has been completely anonymized is difficult. I'm starting to hear French, by the way. It's a bit distracting. You might want to check would someone check their settings? Okay. Guaranteeing that data has been completely anonymized is difficult. The difficulty increases exponentially with the number of variables present. Now, a common standard for assessing anonymity is K-anonymity, which can be calculated easily enough using standard statistical software, and I'm going to be showing you exactly how to do that in the next portion of this workshop. Achieving K-anonymity requires a great deal of data modification or suppression, though the role of sampling, both sampling within the data set and sampling as in the sample the data set has been drawn from, somewhat mitigates this. Software aimed at the general academic survey researcher should not assume special knowledge in the field of data de-identification. However, generally it does. Now, many policies are starting to mandate open sharing of research data. Journal policies are mandating it, funding agencies are mandating it. Most of the academic social science researchers I know, most of the research ethics boards members I'm personally familiar with, most data librarians and data curators do not have the knowledge to assess data for anonymization, even as a first pass rough and ready assessment like I've been talking about here, let alone anything more sophisticated that gets into the problems that come up with big data and really complicated circumstances. The data curators who administer university-based data repositories aren't ready for these mandates. We desperately need more support. And that's what this workshop series is about. And so, if I've scared you in the first half of this workshop, if you're starting to think, I don't know whether my data is safe, then I've done a good job. Big data, especially, is scary. And I'm going to take a final look at the Q&A, and then I'm going to pause briefly for a break. Okay, how about the amnesia tool? Do you consider it a practical tool to anonymize data? That's one of the tools I tested. It's not terrible if you know what you're doing, I think. I got some weird results with it, but I wasn't actually trained in using it. The documentation could probably be improved. I last looked at it about 3 or 4 years ago, so I can't comment on the latest release if it's been released since, if there's been modified since then. It's something I encourage you to play around with. I'm not going to recommend it strongly beyond that. Anonymous participant asks, what is the best way to sample the data in case we want to reduce the risk of sharing the whole data set? How to be sure that the chosen sample of data will also relieve any information? Do we do random sampling? How do we be sure? You're asking a 4-letter word. Sure is a 4-letter word. You cannot be sure. You can only do the best you can. You can reduce risk. The more harm that could potentially be caused by releasing your data, the more careful you need to be. Do you want to do random sampling? Probably. Do you need to customize your response to the individual data set you're looking at? Yes. Am I giving you answers that you can call sure? No way. I'm not going to give you a 100% confident answer because someone would go away and violate it and then sue me. Sorry. Okay. No, you cannot be sure. If you leave this data workshop knowing that you cannot be sure, my job has been done. Okay. Jessica Crudley asks, do you think the average researcher can be trained to anonymize their data? No. Does this seem more like a task for data librarians or data stewards at research institutions? Maybe, but the more data that's out there, the bigger a task it's going to be. In cases where this has come up, some researchers at my institution got a grant on the condition that they anonymize and release their data. What happened was I ended up joining their research team, working with a research assistant, and we went back and forth many times. We worked for hours, days on anonymizing this data set. I trained the research assistant specifically, and I trained them specifically to deal with the problems in this specific data set. Using a specific set of tools. I don't think this is something we have a good answer for yet. This is something for data librarians. This is something for research assistants who are specifically trained. This is a big problem. Okay, Reed Bohm, are there any practices in repository sharing where folks are sharing their K-anonymity or other methods of de-identification in the documentation? Would that be risky or a mode of transparency? If you're sharing an anonymized data set, you probably need to describe in general terms what you did to anonymize the data. You probably don't want to say, I suppressed the answer for X case. That would probably be revealing. You may want to share the code you used for grouping data and constructing variables. It's going to be one of those cases where you're going to have to, again, review in each case to make sure no one's released. Are there best practices? No. I would say a good practice is when you released anonymized data, explain how you derived each variable in your published data, explaining which variables you derived it from. You probably don't want to release the frequencies on the variables you derived it from because that's the point where things might get revealing. In special cases, that may not be good enough. It's, again, I can't give you a complete answer without looking at the data that you're looking at. how to make sure that sampling will represent faithfully the whole data set. Has to be a large enough sample. You probably want it to be a random sample. Basically, you're going to be sampling your data the same way you would be sampling a population and trying to make sure that your sample of the general population represented the sample it was drawn from. In this case, you're sampling a population that is also a data set. And here, I've answered all the questions so far. I'm taking one quick look at the questions. Sarah Cornell asked, will we be able to get a copy of the slides after the session? There's so much great information. The slides are actually going to be used to create some online training that will be made available to everybody. I'm also happy to share the slides. I don't know if there's a plan to share the slides with everyone who attended the workshop, but I would have no objection to that.
Kristi, if I may,
Yep.
actually, yes, from the DRS website, we'll be posting the video recordings, and also we will share the presentations if the presenters are comfortable with it, also on our DRS website, but we will not make additional announcements to the attendees. So you need to come and check back on our webpage, which is www.mcgill.ca/DRS to see when the slides and the recordings are available. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Kristi.
Okay. And I got another question from Rimal Saidi. I'm wondering which would work better, the anonymity or adding noises and differential privacy. Wow. I was aiming this at Data Anonymization 101, you're moving into Data Anonymization Advanced level, but really great questions here. So differential privacy, adding noise is a difficult question. It can be helpful in some cases. One simple thing that can be done is just swapping values. So switching a person from male to female and another one from female to male, things like that. And that can work. It retains the univariate distribution of values in the data set. But when you start doing analyses, things go off. And most different noise adding methods basically have that as the issue. Another is you can take each data point and add noise based on a distribution. The problem is you're increasing the randomness in the data set. So if you publish the data and someone is running things based on that data, the error term will be different than it should have been. Coming up with a balance between exactly how much noise to add and how to retain the analysis value of the data set is a tricky question. It's one of those things that some people push. It hasn't really gained hugely wide adoption. Yeah, there are ways of adding noise to your data. They may be useful in some circumstances. It's a more advanced topic than I'm prepared to cover today. And there are drawbacks, which basically are that adding noise to your data makes analysis of the data uncertain. It makes basically the error term goes weird and it's opaque to the researcher exactly what's going on in the data anymore. Okay. Sonia asks about tools like DP Creator that provides differential privacy. Not familiar with that, so I can't comment. Okay. So I've told you a little bit about data anonymization, about some of the theory behind it, about the limitations. This is the part of the workshop where I start showing you some ways to examine K-anonymity in a couple of different stats packages. If you feel like your brain is already full, don't worry. I'm not expecting people to actually learn how to use Stata or R in the next half hour. I've just picked these as two packet programming languages where it's fairly straightforward to do K-anonymity testing and checking, and wanted to show you that it's actually the mathematical part, the statistical part of checking K-anonymity actually isn't that hard. It's the contextual knowledge and understanding what's going on in the data and what's going on out in the world that your data was drawn from where things get difficult. Okay, I'm going to start by talking about Stata, which is a popular statistical programming language and analysis package. It's basically a statistic-oriented programming language that you use by typing commands interactively at a prompt or writing programs. Stata also comes with some menus that let you do a bunch of basic things by pointing and clicking, but the menu interface isn't as good as SPSS is. It makes up for that by being pretty good as a programming language. It's actually possible to check for K-anonymity in SPSS, and I have a link in these slides that explains how to do it, but it takes a lot more lines of code than in Stata. Here, I'm demonstrating playing with a small survey of about 100 people that was done in North Carolina shoreline communities. This survey has a handful of demographics and a bunch of questions asking about things like how beautiful the environment is, if the fishing and water are good, and if development is ruining the place. So this is not a terribly sensitive data set, and it's also freely available as a demo data set that's included with some versions of in vivo. So it's out there for people to play with. And it's real data. I'm just going to look at a couple of variables here: gender, which has 2 categories, and education, which has 9. I used the tabulate command in Stata to create a 2-way table of education and gender, and it's already pretty clear that we'd be in trouble trying to anonymize this data. There are 4 cells that only have 1 person each, because some of the education categories are really quite small. Here's another way of getting at the same information. eGen, which is just extensions to generate. Generate is a tool used to generate or create new variables. eGen is a Stata command that's used to create new variables based on old variables. It has a bunch of functions you can use with it, but the one I'm looking at here is group, which is basically an equivalence class generator. As you remember, an equivalence class is just a group of cases that have the same values on all variables. So eGen just finds all the data twins in the data set and groups them together based on the variables you give it, and then you can tabulate and see how many cases are in each group. And we can see again the 4 cases that have no data twins corresponding to table cells with a 1 in them. So I've done one-way tabulation of the test K on education and gender, and we can see exactly how many cases are in each equivalence class. So I now use data grouping or data reduction to create a version of the education variable that only had 3 categories. So this is my new education variable, and that helped a lot. I ran eGen again with my new education variable, and this data now meets K-anonymity with a K of 5 on these 2 variables, as we can see both with table and with the eGen test variable. So you may be asking, why am I showing you eGen when you could have just tabulated the variables? Well, tables work fine if you have 2 variables you're looking at. But what if you want to check K-anonymity across 5 or 10 different variables? Even a 3-way table is a serious mess to look at. So here I use 1 line of code with eGen to create a test looking at a group of 4 variables. And 1 line of code, eGen test K based on gender, education, age, and township, tabulate it. And now we see that our data set is no longer meeting K-anonymity at all. So eGen makes life much simpler than if you were trying to look at a table, looking at a 4-way table. Okay. I'm now going to be looking at R. R is also a popular statistical programming language. It's open source, custom purpose language for writing statistical programs like Stata. RStudio is a programming environment that helps you keep track of your files, open and save things, work interactively, and so on. So I'm going to be showing you a typical interactive session using RStudio with R, where I type commands at a console prompt, and R provides its typical extremely terse feedback. And again, I'm using RStudio so that I can show you everything all at once rather than jumping from window to window. Okay, unlike Stata, R is open, free software. It's in general less user-friendly than Stata, but because it's open, there are a lot of user-written add-on packages that do all sorts of useful things. And one of them happens to be a fairly advanced data anonymization package called SDC Micro, which I'm going to be giving you a brief taste of. So, freely available software for anonymizing data. SDC Micro is used by a number of respected nonprofits and statistical agencies around the world, including the International Household Survey Network. For this particular demo exercise, I'm going to be working with a version of a development-oriented household survey done in Afghanistan by said International Household Survey Network. This survey collected a large number of potentially risky demographic variables about the household head, ethnic group, marital status, age, gender, and so on. Note that this is fake data. No real people are having their privacy violated. The example steps I'm showing you are based on a tutorial provided by teamdata.org, who also provided the mock data set. I'm going to be showing you a bunch of code. I don't expect anyone to remember every step. I just want to give you an idea of what this package is doing, and I'm happy to share the code in a code file to anyone who is interested and reaches out to me. So first step is to install the RSDC micro package, as well as whatever utility packages you need. Base R as released and installed, is pretty basic. So when you're using R, you spend a lot of time installing other functions. And that's why I'm demonstrating installing this here, because the first way you run into R is by not having all of the utility packages installed. Having installed these packages, you need to make them available in your current environment. Use the library command, which just tells R that, yes, you're going to be referring to these packages. R has a table function, which works pretty similarly to the one I already showed you in Stata. So here I'm tabulating ethno-linguistic group versus marital status. And we can see already, again, that we've got some categories that are very small. So we only, for example, have one person in this artificial data set who's Turkmen and also divorced. Now we need to set up the data a little bit for the SDC package. And this is where things start getting a little hard to follow. But basically what I'm doing is creating a list of the selected key variables we want to work with. So rather than for each command typing out the key variables I need, doing anegen with a long list of variables, I tell R in advance, these are the variables that I'm going to need to consider while I'm anonymizing this data set. I also need to set up weight variables. SDC Micro will take advantage of the weight variable if your data set has one, to make inferences about the population the survey was drawn from. It doesn't just look at the cases in the data set, but extrapolates to the overall population, much like I did with my Canadian census example earlier. Unfortunately, in that case, my survey didn't come with weights, so I had to create the artificial census. So here I am telling R that the variables to look at for K-anonymity when looking at this particular data set are the following: district, ethno-linguistic group, marital status, age, gender, disability, and total members, which is the number of members in the household. And I'm creating an SDC data object that the toolkit can work with. Behind the scenes, R is computing K-anonymity for all the different possible combinations of all the variables I told it to work with. And I'm also telling it that the R object is using the selected weights variable. And here I say, okay, R, please tell me what's going on. Here R is explaining that it found that 46% of the observations in this data set could be re-identified using just two variables, some of the two variables in that long list I gave it, not necessarily the same ones for each observation. These are the overall results after looking at K-anonymity for every combination of variables in that list I gave it. 65% of the observations can be identified using some combination of 3 variables and 83% by 5 variables. Well, if this were real data, I'd be saying, that sucks. So how do we fix that? Well, one of the risky variables here is age, single years of age. It's pretty obvious to me that that's a bad idea. So I'm going to recode it into 10-year age groups using a single R command. Global recode, object age breaks 10, so telling it to break it at 10-year increments. Now I asked for the K-anonymity report again, and things are looking much better. R not only gives me the new numbers, it tells me how they compare to the original ones. So now 19% of the observations can be identified using 2 variables compared to 46% before recoding. The data is not there yet, but this is obviously an improvement. So now I would work on to recoding some other variables, rerunning the K-anonymity test after each combination, until I get to the point where I decide that the data is sufficiently de-identified. R is more complex than other stats software. In order to accomplish anything, you need to spend time setting things up, looking at environment variables, installing other things, setting weight variables, and getting errors. But in the end, working with R is more often than not more than worth it because you can do quite a lot. And that is the end so far. I'm going to be looking at the online Q&A in a minute. But first, I just wanted to note that I'm Kristi Thompson. My email address is ktom67@uwo.ca. I welcome questions from people who want to discuss anonymization and other topics with me directly, although questions on how can I be sure my data set is anonymized will have to be answered on a data set by data set case, and I'm not necessarily signing up to review everyone's data. And if you're looking for a set of steps that you could apply to every data to be guaranteed that it's anonymized, again, does not exist. Also, I saw some notes in the chat about the images I'm using. All of them were created by me with artificial intelligence using a tool called Night Cafe Creator, using the DALL-E 2 and Stable Diffusion algorithms because I was going for something slightly ominous. And one more note, the next workshop in this series tomorrow is going to be a hands-on practical workshop using the open source data anonymization tool, ARX, Wednesday, October 4th, 2023 at 10 a.m. Please sign up for it if you're interested. And these are some of the sources I cited when putting the status with this together. And now I am going to be looking at the Q&A. Okay. Serge Borode, for noisy methods, maybe publish both the original results and the noised results. Well, I've been talking about publishing raw underlying data, not results. That could be a useful in some cases, depends on what you're doing and what your purpose is. Okay, Dimitri Ufetko. In the evolving landscape of data anonymization, particularly in the content of data privacy, such as GDPR, how can we strike the delicate balance between robust data anonymization while preserving analytic richness of the data to support advanced machine learning? This entire presentation has been saying that that's going to be a delicate dance that you do with every individual data set. Are there any emerging practices in data repository sharing where individuals or organizations are openly sharing their anonymization techniques, such as K-anonymity or other de-identification methods in the documentation? I think that would be a good practice. I don't know of it being made available as a specific, I don't know of any actual documentation standards for that. What are potential risks and benefits associated with such transparency? Again, I cannot give you a single answer for that. It's going to be vary for each data set. You can never be sure. Data anonymization is not a science. It's not an absolute answer science. It's an art. It's something that has to be done with sensitivity to each individual data set, to the environment under which you're releasing each individual data set. And often it's going to need to be done in combination with other techniques, such as licensing, such as releasing subsets of your data to different subsets to different researchers, such as requesting that everyone who used the data set sign some kind of a confidentiality agreement. It's an emerging field. Articles are being published on how to do it at a rate of hundreds each year. I cannot give you a better answer than that at this point, but if you're welcome to reach out to me and chat in the context of specific data sets. Jessica Rudy wanted to share that our SDC Micro also has an RShiny app that runs locally and does what we've shown, provides a bit more user-friendly GUI. Yeah, I've actually played around with the graphical interface. It does make things a little bit easier. I just like the command line. Which McGill website will the presentation be shared on afterwards? I believe that Birgu will be taking that one.
Yes, we'll be sharing on our DRS website, which will be mcgill.ca/DRS. We'll post this website on the chat, in the chat.
Talia Melagon, if the informed consent form indicated the data would only be shared with researchers working on the study, does posting the anonymized data violate the ethical responsibility? Yes. You need to include in the consent form that you will be sharing anonymized data. I worked on a study where the researchers wanted to share the anonymized data and had actually told the funding agency that would be sharing anonymized data, but had told the researchers that they would not be sharing the data. What we had to do was go back and reconsent participants, and the ones that did not give consent for the data to be shared or just didn't respond to the reconsent form, their data was not shared, even the anonymized data. This is something you need to think about ahead of time. So yes, if the informed consent form says, I will not be sharing any raw data, then you are not sharing raw data. Anonymous participant, how can you check K-anonymity in SPSS? Resources provide a link with the approximately 30 lines of code that will allow you to do so. It's possible, it's not the most easy thing to do. You can also just run lots and lots of complicated tables and look at them. Anonymous participant, have you come across any Python data anonymization options? I actually haven't. I've seen routines in R, in Java, and various other programming languages. I'm sure there are. In fact, I'm sure you could code in raw underlying Python how to do basic K-anonymization. Whether there's anything with more complicated items, abilities available, then I honestly don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. And I am not seeing any more questions. Wow. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. You've been a great audience. Oh, one final question. Could synthetic data be considered as anonymous data? If it's completely synthetic and has nothing to do with people, I wouldn't consider it anonymous so much as something else entirely, but I wouldn't consider it particularly risky.